almost all the big commercial greenhouses that I went into were growing those 8 crops, like almost exclusively. It's fruiting crops and leafy crops. And so on the fruiting side, we got tomatoes, peppers, eggplant, and cucumbers. And on the leafy side, you've got lettuce and other mixed greens, like various, cut and come again salad greens, herbs, most notably basil, partially because basil is the most popular herb in North America, and then microgreens, right? So there's this group of fruiting crops, and there's this group of 4 leafy crops. If you look at big commercial greenhouses, that's the bulk of commercial greenhouse production. And so, I was also used to greenhouses that were growing a little bit of everything. And so it made me think, why? Like, these guys must know something, if they're almost exclusively focusing on these crops. I realized that there's a few reasons to grow these crops. And for one thing, they're perishable, right? So you need to be constantly growing a fresh supply of them, right? You can't fill up a cellar full of tomatoes and sell them out over the next 6 months, right? So same thing with greens. The greens are even more obvious. They're so perishable, right? So they're perishable. There's year-round demand, right? People want a nice salad all year round.
It's on every menu at every restaurant. There's a salad, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, if you think about how much salad mix is consumed in the country, it's tons every day, and so there's a market there. And another thing is that those crops are just fetch a high enough price per pound to pay back, right? Because I think this point actually is relevant whether you're a market farmer and trying to support a business, or even this really applies to homesteaders too. Because the thing is, your greenhouse is the most precious real estate on your whole farm, right? Because you invested money in the frame, in the plastic, and all the other components that go into it. And you either invested money or your own sweat equity to actually build the darn thing, right? Mm-hmm. So greenhouse space is the most expensive space to build and maintain on the whole farm. And so it has to return at a whole higher level. And so you need crops. So that's the other thing, is all 8 of those crops fetch a high enough price per pound to actually give you a profit. And you know what, even if you're doing this to feed your family or your family and neighbors or something like that, you still want to get the biggest yield out of that space that you worked and paid so hard to prepare. And so the last thing about all those crops is that they tend to fit into two cropping cycles, either one extremely long cropping cycle, right? Like with enough heat, I mean, there are big greenhouse growers here in North America that will plant a tomato crop in January and take it all the way around to the following December, right? So, you could have an 11-month tomato crop. I don't know very many direct market farmers or smaller farmers that are doing that, but I mean, it's not theory. A lot of greenhouses in North America will grow a tomato crop for 11 or even 12 months. When you consider that if they put the crop in January, that means that the seed was started in December, so that the plants might actually be a year old or close to a year old by the time they come out, right? And so the whole idea is that, tomatoes, you have a lot of labor on the front end. You've bought the seed, you've propagated it, perhaps you've grafted it. So what's the days to maturity on a large fruited tomato? Like 60 or 70 days. So it's after you've already done all the propagation work, it's going to take almost 2 months growing in your greenhouse in the coldest time of year, which, if you're really stretching out the season, you're paying for that time, right? So you got a lot invested on the front end on that crop. But if you can harvest it for 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 months on the back end, that's what makes that investment upfront possible. And so the cropping cycles of most of those other crops aren't quite as long. Like cucumbers tend to be more like 2 to 4 crops a year if people are really trying to cover most of the 12 months of the year. Peppers and the eggplant are similar. So we have these 2 different cycles that tend to pay back in a greenhouse. The long cycle, like all those vining fruiting crops, or the short cycle, right? And that's where you see the short cycle come in on the leafy crops, right? Because microgreens would be an extreme example of that, right? I don't know, Randy. I mean, what's the turnaround time on a microgreen? A month or less?
We do 2 weeks on ours.
Yeah, it depends. A pea shoot might be 7, 8, maybe 9 days. Something like red vein sorrel might be 30 days or 40
cilantro
days.
Cilantro is long, but most of the common stuff, like what we do, it's every 2 weeks we're harvesting.
Yeah.
So, give or take a couple days, but
Yeah, so if you combine, let's say every 2 weeks times, however many months, you either have the natural heat
Yeah.
on an unheated greenhouse, or have heat if you're heating a greenhouse. Do that over and over and over again. You're getting a payout every 2 weeks. Doing that over and over again is what can lead to really good profitability on things like microgreens. The turnover isn't quite as fast on lettuce, but maybe you can harvest a crop of lettuce every month, and similar time frame. I mean, the exact like days to maturity or days to harvest is gonna depend on the variety that you're growing, how much you're heating it, how much natural light and warmth there. There's a lot of factors. I don't want people to get too hung up on exactly what the time frame is, but they get it. If
Sure.
in a warm part of the country, or if you're heating a greenhouse a lot in a cold part of the country, you can get 10 or more harvests of a lettuce or any of those greens.
I think just not to get bogged down crazily in the math, but in your book you talk about pruning to single liter or double liter with tomatoes. And I remember, I think it was it 30 pounds per liter or 30 pounds per plant that you were maybe talking about in the book, but you had the math figured out that one plant was the equivalent of X dollars, right? And that's on a 12-inch spacing per liter.
Mm-hmm.
So when we start unpacking the math, and I think this is so critical for someone that is interested in a hoop house. I've talked to customers on the phone who are super excited about buying a hoop house because they want to put it over their raspberry bushes, or they want to grow fruit trees. Growers that they love the idea of a wooden raised bed, and they love the idea of a hoop house, and they want to put a wooden raised bed inside their hoop house. These are all things that can be done. I never want to tell someone that they're doing it wrong, or you can grow anything you want. You can, with enough energy and resources, you can grow any plant. When you can get 30 pounds of tomato potentially off a liter in a 2 square foot spacing over 6 months, or in that same footprint, you can plant one broccoli plant and harvest one head of broccoli and get $2.50 for it, or 30 pounds of tomatoes at $2.50 a pound, or whatever the math is. There's a pretty strong indication on maybe what direction you should go. And again, there are homesteaders out there, home gardeners. We're still, at the end of the day, even talking putting cans of food on your shelf, feeding your neighbors or bringing them to church or whatever. There's a lot more food, That raspberry bush, man, those are some expensive raspberries in that high tunnel.